Okay, I think we are recording, so let's pretty good. Try to get this camera angled in a good spot. All right. I'll leave it up there somewhere. All right. With that in mind, thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to Software Saturdays as the beginner track for week number 2, which is going to be all about JavaScript. So as a quick refresher to everybody, here's our 5-week plan for the curriculum. We have finished week 1, which is HTML and CSS. Week 2 is all about JavaScript. And then next 2 weeks will be about Vue, which is kind of a framework on top of JavaScript that we are using this course. Kind of the whole point of using Vue actually is to kind of do more cool stuff like that you can do with regular JavaScript. We then end off with some database stuff, and at the very end, we have 2 project weeks. The project demo, if you remember from last week, is fully online as well, so you can take a look and kind of see, and again, planning for how you might want to approach that project. But I'll have full details, including like, a requirement sheet and a more thorough deadline for you guys, hopefully by week number 4, which will have to figure some stuff out for the intermediate project, so it's a little bit of time for that. And if you have any questions at all, please let me know either personally, privately via email or Slack, or post it in, the Slack channel. It's always a great way to get help as well. Speaking of help available, we have 4 different ways you can get help this semester. Obviously, every Saturday here at 3:30 p.m. we meet for 2 hours. You can ask someone then, or we have open review hours on Wednesdays from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. The link for that's going to be in the Slack, so keep an eye out. We'll be posting reminders about that every week. We also will be having our recording sessions on Sunday. I know they're a bit late this week. I'm sorry, I kind of feeling under the weather last week, so I kind of a little bit late editing the videos. But they should be up hopefully today, tomorrow morning. And then finally, Slack, like I mentioned, everyone's on there pretty much every day. So if you have a question, you can just drop it and someone will answer a question pretty quick. All right. And as again, I'm Hadi, the chair of the Software Saturdays program here. We have 3 amazing mentors helping out with our program. We have Sam and Nishant, who are leading the intermediate track in the room next door. And John, who usually helps me, but he's gone today for some personal stuff. All right, and as again, some more beginning stuff. Does everyone here have a text editor? If not, please download one and install it. I personally use VS Code, but honestly, whatever is the one that works for you is the best one that you can do. I know a lot of people like Atom, or there's also like this stuff on like Vim, the command line stuff, or you can use like WebStorm, or really anything works. Notepad++ is really good too. Again, whatever works for you. I personally use VS Code, but that's just my personal preference. And if you want to follow along with any of the example code or demo programs you do in classes, you can always go to the GitHub. The link is on the slides here. It's also posted in Slack as well, so you can get it from either of those 2 locations. All right, before we get too far, were there any questions last week about HTML and CSS? You can just raise your hand, or if you're online, drop it in the chat here, and I'll try to make sure I see that question as soon as possible. Yeah, what's up?
I got a question about last week, but for Visual Studio Code, do we need to download an extension to work with JavaScript?
Yes, the question was, do we need an extension for VS Code and JavaScript? And the answer for that is yes and no. A little bit confusing. So no, by default, VS Code will open up basically any file you could imagine in the text editor, so it'll also work out of the box. And then the no comes from, the yes comes from, if you want to do some more of the advanced like debugging or the more advanced like live reloading kind of things, you may need an extension. But honestly, I don't always use one, so you don't really need to do it as long as you remember to refresh the page every time you save your file. That's the only thing to be careful of.
Okay, would you have a recommendation on an extension you could use?
The one that I recommend the most for web development is going to be the live server extension. It's the word live and server. That one will basically kind of mount a web server to your directory. And so any changes you make to the contents of any file in your directory, it'll automatically reload the web page in your browser. So you can kind of see your changes in real time, so to speak. I love it a lot. I use it all the time for my development projects. But again, it is totally optional. I understand if you don't want to do that. Yeah, in the back. Great question. So VS Code is technically a text editor in that it works for basically any language under the sun. However, a lot of the features that it has are geared towards the more popular languages like web development or Python development mostly. But honestly, I use it for C programming a lot too, or C++ programming a lot. So really, it's a very versatile tool to have. All right. Anyone else with a question? Cool. And people online, can you guys share me okay? Is the audio coming through very well? I know with the mask and the distance, it can be pretty hard sometimes. Time for me to pick it up. All right, sounds okay. Cool, we'll go with that then. With that in mind, let's begin today's presentation. So first, quickly, what is JavaScript? At a very high level, JavaScript really is, like I said, a high-level language that is used to create dynamic web pages. It is used basically pretty much only in HTML, but nowadays, with the introduction of some new JavaScript tools, you can actually run JavaScript outside of an HTML page in like a server backend with something like Node.js. If you're, ever kind of want to go to like full stack development, very popularly used there. And syntactically, JavaScript is very similar to both Python and C, which seems kind of confusing at first, but you'll see what I'm talking about in a little bit. So if you've taken either of these or both of these languages before, you'll fit right into the JavaScript development. Like I said, if you know one or two, the syntax is very similar to both, so it's not too difficult to figure it out. So some quick JavaScript syntactic rules. As a quick reminder, this isn't a programming course, so we won't be teaching you how to program per se, but we will be teaching you the syntax and how to use JavaScript. So if you've never programmed before this class, please talk to me separately so we can work something out, so you can learn along with us basically this next couple sessions. But the four primary things to worry about in JavaScript are these four here: var, let, function, and document. Are kind of like the beginning of your syntax. So just like in C, how you might define a variable with like, int or bool or char or what else, float is the other one that's very popular. In JavaScript, you only use one, either var or let. They have some differences we'll talk about later, but just for now, they both define a basic variable. Now, the one thing to know is JavaScript does not have data types. It's pretty much like Python in that way. Any variable can take on any kind of data at any point in time, really. So you have to be careful when you're coding. You make sure you know what type of data you're supposed to be getting, say, in a function, for example. Function is the name of the sort of a function. It's kind of like the word def in Python for making def a new function. It is the exact same functionality basically is here. And finally, the word document. This is kind of a predefined JavaScript variable that just refers to the HTML page itself. We'll cover this more in part 3 of this lesson here, which is going to be part 2, I forget which one is exactly. But just remember that this is going to come in handy in a little bit. Some more interesting stuff. You got if, else. That's pretty common to most languages. You ever programmed before. And then follow C, for, and while. Again, pretty much like C. So again, if you kind of know some C from like CS159, you'll be just at home in JavaScript. A few syntactic notes. Yes, there are brackets. So please make sure you use brackets for opening and closing an if statement or a for loop or a while loop. Again, like C. And just like C, you have to do a semicolon. So make sure every line ends with a semicolon when you're programming. Other than that, not too much craziness going on. Math is pretty much the same as most programming languages. The only difference here is exponents. That's more Python-like with the 2 stars meaning exponent, so 2 to the power of something, for example. And division is going to be integer division, so kind of again more like C in that regard. And then almost last but not least, you're going to have your comparison operators. Again, these are almost the exact same as C, with the exception of the last 2. So you have your equals to, your greater than, less than equal to, your not equal to, et cetera, et cetera. The only difference you'll see is the very bottom where it says strict not equal to and strict equal to. What that means, we'll talk about that in the next slide. JavaScript by default has some very wonky rules about how it does equality. So unless you know what you're doing, I recommend always be using the triple equals basically, or the double equal sign not equal to, strict equal to it's called. And you'll see why in a second. So how do we actually add a JavaScript file to a page? So there's two ways to add it to a page. The most common way of doing it is by doing an external file, like a .js file, and then linking that file to your HTML page. The second, slightly more, it's both popular and not popular, beginning to become more popular again now, is by embedding the actual JavaScript in the page by itself. In either way, the best way to do that is by using the script tag. So the script tag is kind of like another HTML tag. If you need a refresher, go back to week 1 to figure out what HTML tags are again. Script is going to be defining basically that the next couple, text that the browser sees are not meant for the user, but are meant to be executed by the computer itself. So to load a file, you would do an open script tag, and then again, using those HTML attributes from week 1, you put the word src equals, and then the name of the JavaScript file you're trying to import in quotes after. So for example, in this example, we had a file called script.js in our folder somewhere, and we imported that by doing script src equals script.js. That make sense so far? Cool. So let's quickly show off a demo program to kind of see how all of these things kind of come together. I'm gonna have to, can't see very well here. So we'll do this. There we go. So I have a couple demo files from the GitHub. So if you need a reference what those look like, they're on the GitHub, demo 1 here. And as you can see, there's 3 files in each folder. There's a CSS, an HTML, and a JavaScript file. So first, we'll look at the HTML file. Again, I'm going to open it up in Notepad. So if we quickly show this page here, oh, that's the wrong one, my bad. Screen. There we go, sorry. You can see we have a pretty basic looking, but pretty good HTML page. And as a reminder, if you remember from the week 1, we talked about in the head, we'll basically tell you what to put in there because it can be pretty complicated sometimes. This is an example of that. The bottom 2 tags are the ones that you guys have to care about, the links and the titles. The top 2 are stuff for the browser that we'll give to you guys. Don't worry about them too much. But as a quick reference, this one is defining that our page is going to be encoded in the UTF-8 standard. And this bottom one here kind of resets our view to make it look properly on both mobile and on web browsers. So here is where we link our script tag. It's an src, as you can remember from how we link it in. And the file name is demo1.js. And finally, some basic page, h1, h2, and then a p tag. And this page will look the exact same when you run it. So don't worry about not seeing anything. That's because you won't see anything from this page. Now, if we open up the CSS file, again, very basic CSS file. If we refresh on CSS, go back to week 1. Here's where the fun part comes in, JavaScript. So a comment in JavaScript is going to be a double slash for the beginning of a comment, and then a block comment will be, again, like C, a slash equals. So for example, if we go here, slash equals begins your block comment, your multi-line comment, and then a dot slash ends your multi-line comment. Oh, there we go. So if you want to know how to comment, that's how you do it. I recommend you comment your code a lot, it will be very helpful. So as you can see, we have 2 JavaScript variables. var to define a new one, var test is the name of the variable, equals in the value, 10 in this case. And again, note that we have to have a semicolon at the end there. We do the same thing with let. We have a different variable. This just shows you guys that, again, JavaScript variables do not care what kind of data type is being stored in them. So in this example, in var test, we have a 10 in integer, and in let, we have a string, in this case. Again, like Python, you have to be careful what data you're putting where, because there's no way to tell from the data type, from the variable type itself. To print something, it's a little more complicated because, again, JavaScript is designed to work in a browser. You can only use the browser's tools, in which case the console is the browser's way of actually accessing a lot of the developer tools you can use to print stuff, debug code, view your program, stuff like that. So console.log is kind of like a print statement, but for JavaScript. You can log whatever you want. Again, data types do not matter. So here we're going to log both var test and let test. So you should see 10 and then printed out on our console here. Some basic math stuff. You can see all the math operators here. And also not math operators, this is the additional operators. So you can see we use all of them here to kind of show them. And then the important one here is going to be these bottom, I guess, I don't know how many that is, so almost like about 6 or so. One is that kind of like, again, Python, but not like C, you can compare more than just numbers. For example, we're here to compare strings. And this should indeed be, I believe, false. And the bottom 4 are kind of the trickier ones. Please watch what happens. It may be different from what you think is going to happen. So remember what this is. We're doing 1, the number, equal to 1, the string. All right. If you're familiar with like doing this kind of same thing and like say again C, this should be false, right? Because 1 the number and 1 the C are different values. But what you will notice is that for lines 21 and 23, the actual JavaScript interpreter will make these the one again 21 and 23 be true. 21 should be true, and same 23 with that. So if we run our code here, again to run it, you just go to here and open up in a web browser. So we'll open with where do you go here? We'll do an Edge, no problem. Here's our basic file, like I said, nothing to look at really too much. Oh my goodness. To get your browser console, this is a very good tool I recommend you learn how to use if you want to do web development. You will be in this tab a lot, so get used to it. There are 2 ways to access it, really. The first one is to right-click basically anywhere on your page, click the context menu, and then go to Inspect right here. That'll pull up this little developer window on the side. The second way you can do it is, I believe it's F12. Nope, not that. Oh, sorry, yeah, open it to F12. I believe it on Chrome and on Edge and Firefox, open with your DevTools, but I'm not 100% certain on that one. Once you're here, there are a whole bunch of tabs on the top. Elements is how you can kind of like look at the HTML page and see how it's being rendered by the browser. This is very useful when you're trying to make something look proper with CSS. You can hover over the tag name in the Inspect Element browser, and it'll actually highlight it to you. So you can see, for example, how much margin, how much padding, the size, all of the actual attributes you need to make your code look right. So what we're going to care about today is the console tab. Now here's where we actually print out all of the stuff from our program. It's a log of our console, so I kind of remember that. So if you remember, we first printed out the word 10 and the string because that was what we had first, right, in the let and the var test. We then have a bunch of tests with relational operators, as you can see, that worked the way we thought it would. And finally, we had strictness. Remember, we had the number 1 here equal to the letter 1, the string 1, not a letter, but the string 1. But they came out to be true because JavaScript will sometimes, try to make things true, even if they're not necessarily true. And on the flip side, we had the number 1 not equal to the letter 2, which again should be true like we thought it should be. And then finally the math, and on the bottom here, in the last little bit, here's our basic example of all of the other constructs. So, ifs, elses, whiles, and fors. So, if math test was equals var test, which is definitely not true, we should be seeing a false on line there. So if we pull the browser, wrong browser, we do in fact see a false. And then here's the basic while loop. So this while loop here, you can see is printing out all the numbers between 1 to 4. And this for loop is the exact same thing, but using a for instead of a while loop. And we can see 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, are there any questions about the basic JavaScript syntax or like the basics of JavaScript in general, rather? Yes, in the back.
My console, like, it only gets on mirror.
Yeah, are you sure you have everything imported properly and like typed properly? Typically a big, yeah, there we go. Good. Any other questions? Online or in person again? Please let me know. All right, I think we are okay to be getting to move on a little bit. Time now for a little bit more about the kind of weirder parts of JavaScript. The first one is let versus var. If you recall, I mentioned how they kind of do the exact same thing, which is define a basic variable. Now, the catch with that is never use var. We'll teach you it because a lot of tutorials you see online tell you to use var, but that is actually now considered to be unsafe and not good practice. You instead should be using let. Why? Well, let has a lot of safety precautions and protections that var does not have. And so our code will most likely be less buggy than if we had just used var sometimes. Some examples of the precautions is that when you use var, you can accidentally redefine a variable twice, which will mean you have two copies of one variable, which should be illegal in most languages, but it's not for some reason in JavaScript. And the second big concern is that there's something called hoisting, where if you say you define a variable using var on line, say 5 of your program, but you actually use it in line, say 3, the JavaScript interpreter will move the line 5 to above line 3, which seems kind of useful, but could cause a lot of undefined behavior if we're not careful, which is oftentimes the case anyways. So from now on, please use let and not var, even if tutorials tell you otherwise. And finally, about equality, I mentioned the strict equal to and strict not equal to. What this means is using the double equals only allows JavaScript to what's called coerce or convert the type of two variables. So for example, the number one versus the string one, what JavaScript will do is first try to see, is the number one equal to the contents of this string, which is also one. And again, while that seems pretty useful, is oftentimes going to lead to bugs you can't even imagine about right now, because obviously modern code is very dense and very complicated, and it can be very confusing to figure out what program variables you're actually running with. And so as a result, always use the triple equals, which will not allow these conversions to happen, meaning it'll always check the variables like you would in, say, C, which is typically how we kind of typically think of equality. If you kind of want to see the full mess that is JavaScript equality, I have a link here to a pretty good GitHub site about that. But basically, here are all of the possible random values you can have in JavaScript, and you can see what is true and what is false. And then some of these should definitely not be true, but for some reason are, because of, again, the way JavaScript handles a lot of these word conversions. Here's an example of it again. The string one and the number one, in our minds, yes, while they may be true, if again, you're familiar with C, these aren't true, right? The character string one is an ASCII character like the 80, something like that. The number one is the number one. However, in JavaScript, it'll convert the string to a number and now they're true again, which again is not always what we want for defined behavior. So again, always use the triple equals. That will always make sure that you are not, doing anything kind of wonky with your code. All right, functions. Now, this is a little bit different from, basic code, but still pretty useful. JavaScript functions are the exact same as functions in literally every other language on the planet. You have parameters and return values. You can have as many parameters as you want, but you can only return at most one value from a function. And parameters, can be used to modify how a function calculates numbers, for example. Okay, are there any quick questions about functions? All right. We'll learn demo program number 2 about functions. So let me just close up the old files here, and we will move to open demo 2. So again, the HTML is pretty simple, nothing too complicated there. At this time though, please note we are now linking in demo2.js because demo 1 was the old one, demo 2 is the newer file, so we're using that instead. Yes?
Do we have access to these files?
Yeah, they're on the slides. This I think on slide 5 or 6 should be a link to the GitHub. And if not, in the Slack, in the fall 2121 channel, there definitely is a link to it there. We'll be in the lesson 2 branch of the GitHub in the demo 2 folder. If you're not trying to use GitHub, let me know. I'll be sure to help you out with that in our checkpoint coming up here. All right, the CSS file, again, is pretty basic. The fun part here is in the actual JS file. So we have a whole bunch of functions kind of showing off the different parts of the JavaScript, format. The first one is this no return and no parameters. This just prints out a basic, console.log here. Second one will have no parameters, but has a return statement. So we return the value that there's some kind of string here in this case. And then finally, we have it all tied together. We have both all the functions with 2 parameters and with 1 return variable. Here, we just add together our 2 numbers. And then we finally call them down below, you can see right there, and we can just print them out to make sure that they run the way we think they run. So again, to test it out, we go to our our file explorer. We'll navigate to demo 2 folder and run the HTML file. So we open with a web browser. All right, and again, if we hit F12, you can see the output should be exactly what we think it is, in which case we first print out no return because we had no return or parameters. Second one had a return value of the string here. And the final one was returning the number 1 plus the parameter number 2, which was 1 plus 2, or in this case, number 3. Are there any questions about functions? All right, cool. I guess as I mentioned, they're pretty much bog standard to pretty much every other language on the planet. So it should be pretty familiar if you know, again, like C or even Python. Okay. We're going to have our first checkpoint, I believe, of 3 today, or 2 maybe. The checkpoint for you guys, or the task for you all, is to try and write the FizzBuzz program in your editor. If you have no idea what FizzBuzz is, it's a very common programming question that's used in interviews around the world, basically, to kind of make sure that people know how to code. And here are the instructions. Write a function that prints the numbers between 1 and 100. For multiples of 3, though, print the word fizz instead of the number. And for multiples of 5, print the word buzz instead of the number. If a number is both a multiple of 3 and a multiple of 5, print the word FizzBuzz. We'll give you guys about 20 minutes to work on that. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will be, kind of walking around making sure everyone has an idea of what they're doing. A little bit more about JavaScript. Okay, so first things first, arrays. JavaScript arrays are very similar to Python lists in that, and C arrays too in some ways. They are defined with square brackets, which is again similar to many other kind of languages. And arrays can hold essentially any type and any quantity of data. So in this example array here, we have the number 1, number 2, -5, the float decimal point -0.56, and the value true. Please remember that arrays are 0 indexed, so that the first element is going to be index 0. In this case, the 1 is a 0, technically speaking. Index number 2, or array element number 2, the number 2 is index 2, and then so on. So that's element 3, index 2, and then so on, and so forth. Now, unlike C, but kind of like Python, the arrays can basically hold any kind of data. So in this one list, or array, to make the proper term, we have both integers, decimals, and booleans, and all in one big, array here. So just be careful again when you're doing lists, arrays, arrays in Python, JavaScript. Oof, getting confused there. You always make sure you know what kind of data you're storing, because it can be very easy to have the wrong input to, say, function, for example. Well, I think I might have missed something. I did not. Okay. Yeah, so arrays are not too complicated, but we have a quick demo for that. Now, this is actually going to be 2 demos, so we're going to keep the files open for all 3, or all 2, sorry. But demo 3 is just going to be a basic HTML file And here is the demo3.js file. As you can see, it's a pretty generic JavaScript array. You know, we have a number, it's kind of like kind of a mix of data types as we saw. And to get the length of the array, you do the name of the array dot the length function. Length will be a predefined variable in the JavaScript library that tells you the length of how long your array is. And again, to index it, you do the bracket notation. So array, then bracket the name or the index number. Now, again, note the name does not have to be array. We're just using array for our example code here. It can really honestly be whatever you want to make it, not an issue. So we're not going to run this code only because demo 3 and demo 4 kind of come together. So we'll kind of go over demo 4 really quick before we jump into that. So this one is a bit more complicated. JavaScript objects. So JavaScript object, or JSON is the kind of shorthand file version of it, is JavaScript object notation. It's basically a very fancy array or a Python dictionary, if you're familiar with that kind of context. And it is probably one of the most popular and widely used data transfer formats on the web. You will be using JSON and JavaScript objects a lot for your final project. So please make sure you're kind of familiar with how this works. So JavaScript objects use a key value pair in a kind of a curly bracket structure. The key is used to reference the data, and the value can be any data you want referenced, kind of like a hash map if you're more familiar with those on the CS side of things. However, do note that because, again, JavaScript is very loose on what defines the data types, you can store any kind of data in the value for the key value pair. That includes things like arrays and objects, meaning you can have a nested object within an array of an object. So really, you can make some pretty complicated data structures all by doing stuff with this. So keep that in mind. Does this slide make sense to you guys? The idea of a key value pair? Again, if you kind of ever used a Python dictionary, it's almost the exact same thing, but there's a different syntax, of course. All right, so here's the demo for us talking about. Here's a very basic JavaScript object. We have our school name, a couple of keys, school, location, participants, is online. Actually, it can be false because we're not online anymore. Actually, it's online too, I guess, to an extent. And then an array. So again, note, we have within this JavaScript object different kinds of data. We have strings, we have an array, we have a Boolean. So you can really mix and mash it any way you want throughout your code. You can then do some kind of fancy stuff with it to print it out, kind of see the whole object. You can just print out the entire object using console.log, and that'll kind of nicely format it, but it's a little bit harder to see things. You can then also actually modify specific or get specific properties of the object. In this case, you can get the properties one of two ways. The first way is by doing object and then in brackets the name of the key. This is very useful if you say if you want to get the key based on some variable, you can put the variable name in there. So it's kind of like indexing an array, but a little bit trickier because the key will be a string and not a number like it was for arrays. And the second, which is kind of newer for a lot of people, is you can get it by doing the dot notation. Where in this case, it's going to be object dot the property name, or school in this case. What we expect is when we run this code, both the top line, I think it's 11 and 14 console.log statements should both print out per due, because they are both accessing the school property just in different ways. And finally, you can change it by doing the same thing. So the object, and then somehow, either by the indexing or the dot notation, get the property equals the new value. So we're changing this to online. We're going to print out the new location. This code makes sense to everybody. Is it kind of, do you see what's happening? Okay. So let's run our code. So we'll go here to the demo3-4 folder, and we will run our code. So if you see, we first print out the array, which again was a whole bunch of numbers. And the reason I say that it'll format nicely for you is if you print out an object or an array to your browser console, it'll actually kind of condense stuff for you into a nice, easy drop-down list. So for example, it has like the name of the object, which is an array. It'll show you the data, each of the keys, and then give you the link at the bottom. So you can kind of quickly debug your code by just printing out the entire array. This is very different from like C or Python or even MATLAB, if you want to go to that to 132 style, because those languages do not have that kind of nice grouping feature. And then you can see we have a different indexing here. The length is 5, which matches. And then element 2 is true, and index number 0 is 1. Now here is the object. Again, it tells us it's an object, so we expand the object. We'll see it has an array as one of the keys. So we have 4 elements, 1, 4, 50, -4. Then we also have all the keys. Is online, location, participants, school, etc., etc. And if you look, the output of our prints were indeed Purdue, and then finally online after we changed it in our code. So, and I guess the really cool part comes in, this array tab is also expandable. So you can actually see the array and the links from within the object. So again, if you're not sure what your code is doing, just print it out. The JavaScript interpreter and the browser console really do some pretty cool stuff when it comes to formatting your print outputs properly. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Do we kind of get JavaScript objects? Cool. And again, this will definitely be one of the most important things we learned so far. So please, it will come in back to bite you if you don't understand it properly for week even 4 or 5, even 3 to an extent. Okay, checkpoint number 2. It's a bit more open-ended, so nothing too specific in terms of tasks, but I want you guys to create a dealership of cars using arrays and objects. So what I'm envisioning here is you have some sort of an array of objects, and each object will have some kind of keys, maybe your make, your model, your color, whatever you want. And then at the end, can you print them out to the console tab? And if you want to go a little bit more advanced about it, can you figure out how to nest an object within an object? And then how can you access properties from the nested object? That's kind of a trickier thing to figure out. All right. The last little bit for today is all about responsiveness. So someone asked me how you print to the page instead of the screen. This is how you do it. So how do you modify HTML and CSS? Well, a couple ways to do it, but basically we get the main ways based on a document keyword we talked about in that slide, very early slide of this presentation. We won't really spend too much time on this, I only do it ourselves a lot, because Vue, which is the thing we'll learn next week, will do all of this for us and more actually. So really, it's not really good it's good to know how to do it if you need to do it manually, but there are a lot more efficient ways to do it than you possibly ever could do. So how do we refer to HTML elements from JavaScript? Kind of pull them basically. Well, we can use classes or IDs. If you need a refresher on classes and IDs, please refer to last week's presentation. We're going a lot more detail about it over there. But as a real quick refresher, classes there can be multiple tags with the same class, but IDs have to be unique. That's like the one thing about IDs. And we can use classes and IDs actually to refer to either a single element or a group of elements using JavaScript. So here are like the 4, let me move out of the way here, the 4 fundamental methods that you will use when manipulating JavaScript from HTML. The first one is going to be, is going to be document a keyword referring to the entire HTML page, get element by ID, and that will return you a JavaScript element, a HTML element with that ID you put in quotes next to the name over there. Get elements by class name, note the S there. This will return an array of all the elements that have that class name. You give it to it in quotes there inside the parentheses. And you can manipulate them or do whatever you want with them. And then 2 more specific methods are the element name.innerHTML and the element name.style. Now note, the element name here in the angle brackets does not mean the name of the elements that you want to modify, but rather the name of the JavaScript variable storing the element. So from example, the return value of get element by ID dot inner HTML or dot style. And that allows you to manipulate both the HTML and the CSS of any particular tag. Buttons are a little bit simpler. So we learned about buttons, how they're kind of useless. Last week, we know that in JavaScript to do them. But to add JavaScript, all you have to do are do the button and then the word on-click equals, and actually that should be a single pair of quotes. I don't know how there are double quotes there. My apologies. Should be button equal on-click, and then in a pair of quotes, the name of the function you want to run on that button click. So here's the sum function, but again, the function name can be whatever you want, just kind of like an event handler to your button, basically. So again, as you can see, it's pretty basic, but there's a lot of things you can do with this that you haven't even thought about yet. And the best part is Vue really does a lot of this under the hood for you. So you don't have to figure out how to do it yourself, because it'll be taken care for you by a much better algorithm than humans. So we'll just close out all old files here. And we are going to open up demo number 5. Okay, so the HTML is a little bit more complicated here. You'll notice that we have a couple tags, h1, h2, with the class of heading in these ones. So not the class name, remember, it's heading. We then have a paragraph here, a P, with the please change ID. And then finally, the on-click for this button here is change page. This is the function name. Now, one thing I would highly recommend you do is if we're loading in a script tag that will modify the contents of your web page, please, please, please put it underneath after all of the content for your page. The reason I say that is because if you were to put this script tag above the h1 tag, for example, there's a small possibility that when you go to run your code, it will cause a lot of errors because the classes and IDs defined after it have not yet been defined to the page. So just to make it easier and to kind of remove any possibility of bugs occurring in your code, it is always good practice to have your script tag go at the very bottom of the page. And this will make sure that the page is fully loaded before it tries to run it, basically. Now the JavaScript file consists of basically only a single function, change page. Bless me, sorry. So you can see that there are two components to this. There is the P tag component and the H tag component. P tag, we get element by the ID, please change, which should be the HTML, and we change the P tag, sorry, and we change the HTML to this page was changed. So we should see the text go from whatever was before, which I believe was this long text right here, to the page was changed. And then finally the H tags, you can see we are getting now every element with the name heading, which would be to the h1 and h2 tags. We then in a for loop, because again, remember, get elements by class name returns an array of elements. So we have to go through the array. So we have an array going through the entire for loop going through the array. And then within the for loop, we go for h tags at I, getting one element from the array every iteration. And from the style, we then change the color to be blue. Now, if you note, the actual style object is a bit kind of different. You do the dot style, we saw before, and then dot the property name. So remember, you can change any CSS property you want on the elements. In this case, again, we're taking the color, which is the text color of the actual text within the H tags. But any CSS property we learn about at all is going to be valid within there. And we change it to blue. Does anyone here want to take a wild guess and tell me what is the element defined as? Knowing we learned about objects and how we access properties of objects, what do you think the HTML element is defined in JavaScript? Any ideas? Yeah. So if you look at how simple on the p tag line on line 5 that is right there, that HTML, given that snippet of code, what do we think p tag is? What kind of data structure we learned about just today? An object, right? And why we think that? Called dot. We do a dot in the property name. So remember, JavaScript objects are going to be everywhere. So make sure you understand how they work. And similarly, don't forget, because of what we just talked about, you can nest objects within itself. Dot inner HTML is just going to be some text, but you could very well point that to another JavaScript object, and the HTML renderer or the JavaScript will instead make that be the HTML on the page. So really, it's a very flexible tool. I think some pretty interesting stuff. So we'll go back and run demo 5. All right, so if you look at the code here, we have, something that looks pretty similar. We can click the button and boom, we see two things. One, the green text here changes from that long string to this page was changed. And the headings went from red, if we refresh the page, they were red before, but after clicking on it, they turned into the blue text color. So we are modifying the HTML from JavaScript. And that's how you can make pages really responsive and dynamic to fit the user, basically. And that's all Vue is trying to do, but much more efficiently and much more powerful. No, nothing, because it's only a one-time thing. It'll just change it one time. But you can, with some fancy code, actually do it to the button, do different things depending upon how many times you clicked it, for example. That should be pretty easy to do if you want to fill that out for yourself. All right. Were there any questions about responsiveness in JavaScript, like modifying the page, either styling or the text? All right, cool. So there is a lot to JavaScript, actually. We really went over the absolute minimums you have to know to make pages reactive and responsive. But really, you can do so much more, like lambdas or anonymous functions, async functions, GET requests, object-oriented programming. Really, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. And if you want to learn more, it's a good tutorial here that goes into more in-depth stuff about JavaScript. Last checkpoint of the day. Before that, though, we'll jump into our last little bit here. First, of course, thank you for coming so much. If you could please fill out the feedback form you guys see on screen. We really do appreciate the feedback a lot. It helps us kind of improve and make sure that we know what we're doing so that we can make sure that your experience here is as good as it possibly could be. And as a reminder, our office hours are going to be on Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. over Zoom. With that in mind, our last checkpoint for today is going to be checkpoint number 3, which is to modify the FizzBuzz program we wrote in checkpoint number 1 to now instead modify the HTML web page. So what I mean is, what you want to do is when you run the program or click a button or whatever you want to do, it will automatically add the 1, the 2, the fizz, the buzz, etc. to the actual page. So you can see the output of it not on the console, but on the regular page. And if you want to be a little bit fancier, I recommend it, try to change the colors. So for example, the word fizz might be red or blue or something. The word buzz is going to be green, and the FizzBuzz is yellow. I don't know, whatever you want to do. But basically, have it so that the page is now being changed, not just the console.